Dr. Jenny Schuetz, Vice President of Infrastructure, Housing at Arnold Ventures, and author of Fixer Upper, explains why home prices have stretched from the historic 3 to 4 times household income to 5 times and beyond. She explains why their answer runs through state and local rules rather than the market. She breaks down what's actually holding back new homes, why approval times matter to anyone lending in construction, and the one change she'd make first.
Right now, what we have is a series of policy failures that are keeping markets from working the way markets want to. And, as a good economist, that makes me very frustrated because it's really inefficient. And I think we need to start tackling some of the underlying policy problems. Getting rid of zoning doesn't necessarily solve the problem. And the easiest sort of counterexample is the UK doesn't have zoning, and it's the one country that has a worse housing market than the US. Townhouses are kind of this little secret weapon here.
I'd like to welcome everybody to the Construction Lending Podcast today. I'm your host, Sean Ferris, and today we've got a phenomenal guest. We've been talking offline for a couple minutes, and I think we just keep this going all day. But we have Dr. Jenny Schuetz, who is the Vice President of Infrastructure Housing at Arnold Ventures, where she leads the philanthropy's national portfolio to expand housing supply through federal, state, and local policy reforms. She is one of the most cited and most visible housing economists in the country and the author of Fixer Upper, How to Repair America's Broken Housing System. So welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
That book alone kind of gets me excited. It's like, ooh, you wrote a book about the thing that I love the most. So before we dive in here and I start bombarding you with questions, you don't get to write a book about something like this, and you don't get the background that you have today just right out of the box. You don't graduate high school and go, God, that sounds really, really interesting. Let me go build a career there. What I would like to know is, like, how did you get here? What shaped you in a way that made this really interesting for you to get involved with?
I fell into housing completely by accident. When I came out of college, I was just interviewing for a job that paid the rent, and I got a job with a public sector consulting firm. So it's a private company, but they work with public agencies. And they hired me for this new program they were standing up to do consulting with local public housing authorities. So this was sort of the late Clinton era, and housing authorities were being given more authority to run their properties, kind of like private sector asset managers and property managers. And they had no idea how to do that because they'd never been given that kind of toolkit before. So I spent a couple of years going around the country to mostly pretty distressed housing authorities. So places like, Newark and Cincinnati in the late 1990s and Baltimore, and just became really fascinated by how different housing markets were across these cities. Places like Boston had a 10-year wait list, and St. Louis had, 30% vacancy because nobody wanted to live in their apartments. They could get good, cheap apartments elsewhere. So I was just fascinated by how different these housing markets were and different neighborhoods across cities. And I thought, this is really cool. I want to do more of this. And I want to learn more about not just kind of the public housing and the subsidy side, but just how housing markets worked.
Super interesting. Did you see any broad themes kind of when you were working with all these different housing authorities? Was there anything that stood out as like, oh, that's kind of interesting?
I mean, one of the things you see very quickly is that location is the driver of housing prices and rents, which, is obvious to people who work in the real estate world. But, you'd have like a public housing property that was close to downtown Boston, that was on the T line, that was close to lots of jobs, and everybody wants to live there because it's got a lot of access to amenities. And then you go to the north side of St. Louis, and you literally can't get people to move in for free because it's an area that had really high crime rates, didn't have jobs. There just wasn't any opportunity there. It's very clear that where people live impacts their opportunities, kids and adults both, and their well-being, kind of day-to-day quality of life. And so that really resonates. We want people to have economic opportunities. We want people to live in safe neighborhoods and in safe buildings. And for a lot of people, that's just not going to be affordable. It costs too much. There's too much competition for those high demand locations.
what was as you kind of think back on that period of your career, we're going to start moving forward here in a little bit. When you start thinking about kind of like that period in your career, were there any big successes that you saw during those time periods? And I almost measure like housing change in the form of like presidential terms, right? There's kind of chunks of big policy change that filters down, but what were kind of the big things that you saw change during that period?
So that was the era of Hope 6, when housing authorities were demolishing a lot of their huge high-rise towers, very dense, and replacing them with smaller scale, lower rise, smaller communities, more mixed income. That program has its controversies. Some cities probably went too far and tore down a lot of housing they weren't able to replace. But I think we really got to a consensus that it's not a great idea to have very large neighborhoods that are entirely composed of really, really poor people sort of packed together like sardines in a tin. That's just not a healthy place to live. And that neighborhoods work better when you've got people at different kinds of incomes. You've got some homeowners, you've got some renters, people who are working at different kind of income levels, that neighborhoods just function better, and those are better places for most people to live. And, I think most of us also think those are more interesting places, like a neighborhood that's entirely rich people in a gated community or entirely poor people in public housing. Those are not the most interesting places and not the places that our cities really ought to have.
No, really interesting. When we kind of think that part of your career all the way up to where you are today at Arnold Ventures, because I really want to learn a little bit more about like, hey, what are you doing today? Is there anything in the middle there that kind of as you transform from one to where you are today that we would find interesting?
If you stick around the real estate world for a while, you see the cycles and the problems that kind of come and go. So when I was in graduate school, I was in Boston, and I was really interested in how the Boston suburbs made it hard to build apartments and rental housing. And so that's how I got pulled into zoning, because this was just around everywhere. And you could see the housing shortage getting worse in real time, and could see also why it was getting so bad in places like Boston, where you can't build anything. There's a lot of very hyper local control. So that was a big focus of graduate school. Then I came out of grad school in 2006, started working on some kind of early stage work on foreclosures and like clusters of foreclosures in New York City that were getting sort of more attention. And then, by like 2008, nobody was paying attention to zoning and housing shortage, and foreclosures was the entire real estate market, right? Construction crashed. And so there was sort of a time of, our city's going to recover, neighborhood's going to recover, our prices ever going to get back to normal? Are people going to start building again? And of course, at some point we did. And then we went right back to the problem we were in before, which is that we never made it easier to build housing in high demand locations. And so when demand started coming back, we were right back in the place of prices and rents rising faster than income, high demand locations, high amenity places, strong job markets becoming less and less affordable. And it's like in between, we had this sort of downturn, and nobody actually fixed the underlying problems.
That's interesting. It just got less of a conversation during it, almost like a 10-year, like a decade period, right? 8 to 10 years kind of sat right in there where, the housing demand wasn't that big because there was plenty of housing that was available, and prices were shooting. We're already bottoming out, but it was just took a long time to recover. You know, let's flash forward to where you are today, right? You've done a lot of work with zoning and housing authorities, and really understanding how the economics of everything start to play in. Tell me a little bit about Arnold Ventures and what you're doing over there today.
Yeah, Arnold Ventures is a philanthropy. So we make grants, but we also do a lot of direct policy engagement. The housing portfolio that I lead is focused entirely on expanding housing supply. So our whole mission is make it easier to build homes of all shapes and sizes in more communities. And we do that through a couple of different kinds of grant making activity and engagement. We support a lot of the state and local advocacy groups that are pushing for zoning changes, better comp plans, better building codes in their communities. We also are trying to understand how particularly local governments are able to implement these policies on the ground. Very often the state level change means that local governments have to rewrite their zoning. And there are a lot of small local governments that just don't know what better policy looks like and don't have the resources and the expertise to put that in place. So we're trying to support them in that. We do quite a bit of research trying to understand what works and what doesn't. I mean, we do not want to be spending political capital fighting for policy changes on paper that don't produce more houses on the ground. And, we're trying a lot of new experimentation. So some of these policy changes will work and some of them won't. We want to evaluate them, understand what works, and then scale that up and replicate that elsewhere, and really sort of kicking the tires on what don't we know yet. There's been a lot more research on zoning and land use regulation than on hard costs and things like building code. So we need to understand more, what's driving the actual hard costs of building. How can we bring this down? How can we get to better and more efficient processes? So there's still a bunch of knowledge gaps where we are still pretty early in figuring out what better policies actually look like.
No, that is very cool. I think you got like my dream job right there. How do you think about what the big problem is today? And I think it's good to kind of level set on that is, why do we even need to have housing reform? Why do we need to have policy changes? What's driving all this?
So we often start by talking about the number of homes that we're short. Estimates are maybe sort of 4 to 7 million homes short. But I think a better way to think about this is, why do we care about a shortage of housing? It's because we care about the well-being of people who live in homes and who live in neighborhoods. And so one of the easiest ways to think about this is just, it used to be that housing prices cost roughly 3 to 4 times household income. And that's sort of the range that we think people can afford to spend and still have enough money to pay for food and transportation and healthcare and all the other things. Over the last 5 to 7 years, we have seen price to income ratios in more parts of the country go up into sort of the dangerous range. So, 5 times income. California is in the like 10 to 12 range.
Yep. I was like, that number seems a little low.
Yeah. California is off the charts. It's, a whole country by itself. But, what this really tells us is that the cost of getting into a decent quality home in a neighborhood that has opportunity is getting out of reach for more and more people. And this is mostly a problem for people who are earlier in their career, younger households, because they don't earn as much yet. They haven't had as long to accumulate savings. And so you're sort of first-time home buyers.
First-time home buyer. Okay.
Yeah, renters and people who want to transition to be first-time home buyers are having a really tough time. In demographics, that translates to younger households. And, I find when you talk to people who are under maybe age 40, 45, many of them are really pessimistic about whether they will ever be able to buy a home of the quality that they want in a neighborhood where they want. And they just see the sort of dream that their parents and grandparents had that may be slipping out of reach. And so I think, it's really important, especially when we talk to people outside the real estate industry, to talk about the human costs. Not building enough homes means they're, 20-somethings living in their parents' basement longer, people delaying kind of starting their own life, people who can't move to places like California to start a new tech company because it's just too expensive to be able to move there. And so there are real human costs as well as the economic costs. And I think that's important for kind of motivating this story.
How much of that problem has changed since the big refi boom, right? So if I think about, just housing supply and housing availability and, boomers retiring, or, the migration of, hey, you usually live in, I think it's like 4 or 5 homes in your lifetime. And now people are kind of locked in place at that, really low interest rate, and they're not going to that second home, which is not freeing up that inventory as people migrate to the next thing. How much of that do we have like a new problem there because people are not moving up or moving out, versus, hey, it's still the same problem, it's just shaped differently?
We're definitely more stuck in place than we used to. And this has actually been going on for a long time, that people move less, like move across the country or to a new city for a new job less than they used to. It's not entirely about housing costs or even about interest rates, because it's been going on for a while, but it has certainly gotten worse. I'm super lucky. I bought my current house in 2018. We refied during the pandemic. So would I give up my 2.75% mortgage and move someplace else? Not very easily. So there are some of us who have done really well and don't have an incentive to move. Or if people move and they have this really low interest rate on their existing home, they may keep it and rent it out rather than sell it, which they probably would have done 10,
Yeah.
15 years ago. So we have people moving less turnover in homes that are available to move into, less turnover of homes becoming available for sale. And then layer on top of this, we also have an aging population. So people are living longer, staying healthy longer, staying in their homes longer, which is great. On this sort of level, we want people to have long and healthy lives, but we haven't really figured out what the implications are for people staying in maybe a 5-bedroom home that they don't need and not freeing that up for younger households with kids who are looking for a larger place to move into.
What if we, I think one way to think about this too is what if we do nothing? What if we just say, hey, housing prices are going to go up, the market needs to solve itself. People can go figure this out on their own. So what if they have to rent? Not, home ownership is not a right. It's an earned luxury, right? Shelter is probably closer to a right. Why not think about it in those types of terms? And why do we have to, mobilize and try to focus on this problem?
I mean, part of it is that the housing market is segments that interact with one another. So it's not just that the price of homes to buy and have as an asset have gone up and rent has stayed the same price. I mean, rent has also gone up relative to incomes. So, even people who choose to stay renters, maybe because they're planning to move in a couple of years and they don't want to be locked in, they're still paying more for rent relative to their income than people were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, which means also then they have less money to save up, whether it's for a down payment or to start a business. The well-being of people depends on how much income they have and how much they have to spend for necessities. People are having to spend more on housing and less on other stuff if they want to live in a good location now, and that's not great for other sectors of the economy. So we want people to have good quality housing, high amenity neighborhoods, economic opportunity. Whether they rent or own should be up to them, right? And we know that some people want to rent, they don't want to do the maintenance, and yard work associated with being a homeowner. That's perfectly fine, but we want people to have choices that fit their budgets and that fit their lifestyle. And right now, too many people don't have good choices available to them. And I should say too, I'm sure we'll get more into the sort of the reasons why. It's not like this is the market is broken somehow. This is very much a function of layers of policies that particularly state and local governments have chosen to adopt, right? So as an economist, I can live with market outcomes that maybe redistribute resources in ways that we might not love, but like that's the way the market operates. And then you think about how to support people who need help. But right now, what we have is a series of policy failures that are keeping markets from working the way markets want to. And, as a good economist, that makes me very frustrated because it's really inefficient. And I think we need to start tackling some of the underlying policy problems.
So would you say a majority of it is just heavily weighted in policy at the state? I would say state, right? State and local level, or is that where, like, hey, where most of the attention should be paid?
Yeah, the bad policies are mostly at the local level, but we focus a lot on states as a lever of change because states have a lot of tools available to nudge local governments. Local governments are actually a tool of the state. They were created by the state, and so the framework they operate on, what kind of powers they have are created by the states. And so states can do a lot to nudge local governments to adopt more housing-friendly policies, or even things like financial matches to encourage them just to build more housing.
Here's a good one. How do we know if policy is bad? Right? When you look at this, there's probably certain flags, or you smell smoke. It's like, oh yeah, that's probably not doing what the thing you think it's supposed to be doing. How do you identify even bad policy?
Well, bad policy is partly in the eye of the beholder. So if we take, zoning rules that prohibit all structures except single-family homes on large lots are great for the people who live in those homes already and want the value of their home to go up and want their neighborhood never to change at all. So some people would say those are great policies, But then for the people who can't yet live in those communities, the renters who want to buy, or people who have been priced out, people who work in the community, but they can't afford to live there, like a lot of teachers and firefighters, those policies are bad for people who want to have access to the community. And ultimately, a bad policy is the result of a political process. The reason we wind up with bad policies is that somebody is benefiting from them and wants that policy in place. And then we have these political tensions where people who are currently harmed by the system, who are harmed by affordability, are trying to change policies. And many of the people who benefit from those policies right now really don't want to be flexible and don't want to embrace change.
So let's focus in on zoning, right? So doors open on zoning and kind of like the single family. And it talks the way you kind of framed it was almost is the existing property, the existing stock that's there under single family versus, hey, we should stop that practice and we should consider it like this. Or is there a discussion around that exists, those homes that have been there for 40 years that are single family, that, are on large acreage, that have sold, they're privately owned? Like, is there a conversation to be had about what's already there and what people have already bought into? Or is it more about like, how do we think about it moving forward?
So zoning is very good at locking things into their existing form and not allowing change, right? So the main problem really is in places where we've built out subdivisions, maybe in the 40s and 50s, as low density, single family detached homes. Over time, the value of land has risen. And so if you were going to buy that parcel today, you probably wouldn't put a single family house on it, or you'd put, more smaller homes next to one another townhouse cluster, because the land has gone up in value. And so you want to have essentially more built floor space on that piece of land. But zoning locks in what's already there and doesn't allow this kind of flexibility. So we see this in some of the neighborhoods that were built out in the 40s, 50s, and 60s that probably could be redeveloped today as maybe some fourplexes or sixplexes. Or we see things like surface parking lots around single-story shopping centers, where now you wouldn't build that because that's a pretty low value use. You'd want to redevelop that as maybe a mixed income, mixed use housing and retail and shops and so forth. And so zoning is prohibiting neighborhoods from evolving in the way that the land value or sort of the demand for that location would suggest it should be moving. So the idea is like zoning should be more flexible. We should allow a wider range of structures as of right. So, not just single family detached homes and giant apartment buildings, but all the things in between, townhouses, mid-rise apartment buildings, duplexes. And so allowing more flexibility in more locations then allows property owners and developers to say, hey, here's a parcel where what's on it currently doesn't match kind of the highest and best use. Let's go in and imagine it as something else. Let's add more housing where we need to, add a different kind of housing, including replacing some of the older houses that are not in great shape anymore, that really ought to be replaced with something that's newer, higher quality, more resilient, more efficient.
No, I love that. I love that. So it's more about, hey, it's already existing, but over time things have changed, right? And what you're running into, it sounds like, is the resistance to change. Hey, that's a single family neighborhood. We don't want to change with the zoning, right? So, is the problem what I would call more of like a cultural problem within that, not necessarily community, but within that jurisdiction? Hey, they've got their mindset that, this is the way things that should be, and they're not not wanting change. Or, I live in a community where, our building and planning department is completely different than what you would expect. They're not really there to help you. They're really there to say, no, it's got to stay single family. No, you can't build onto that home. No, that permit's going to cost $100,000. Is it more kind of changing the culture within what they're trying to, kind of achieve overall, right? If we think about being helpful, right? Letting somebody change the zoning versus, just the automatic no. How much of it is that versus, hey, there's bigger forces at play, and, you're fighting a completely different war than Sean's thinking about?
A lot of it really is about changing hearts and minds, but some of it is also about changing the process of information that gets to elected officials. So, the zoning code is something that your city council, your mayor, your county supervisors have to approve, right? So this goes through the local kind of democratic policymaking process. And I think for a long time, we've sort of assumed that local governments that listen very closely to their long-term homeowners, and the way that zoning laws get changed is that you have a community meeting, sort of stereotypically, Tuesday night in City Hall or in the community auditorium, people come together and they say, should we be making some changes to allow more apartments, to allow more flexibility and do development? And the people who show up at those meetings have historically been long-term residents, homeowners. They tend to be older. Retirees who have more time on their hands, they tend to be wealthier, and they're very invested in keeping the community the way it is. But what we're learning from some of the political science research is that often those stubborn homeowners who want no change are a minority even within their city, their county, or their neighborhood. But it's just that other people are busy with jobs and families and lives and don't have the time to show up and speak. So one of the things we're trying to do is more broad-based polling and surveys to get a sense, if 2/3 of the people in your city want to have more flexible zoning and more homes, but the 100 people who show up on Tuesday night are the ones who don't want change, why do you listen to them and overweight their opinion relative to the majority of people who aren't there, right? And so elected officials, I saw you had Buffy Wicks on your podcast recently. Elected officials like Buffy Wicks are starting to get the message. There's actually a big constituency that wants change, that wants more flexibility, more modern housing, and more options. And so that should be driving policymakers' decisions and give them more comfort in doing something new and different.
Very interesting. If I put my city councilman hat on, right, and I'm kind of thinking from their perspective, and I've got 100 people, they pack the city council room and tell me they don't want something. I don't want to be on social media voting opposite of the way that everybody else is telling me that they want. And should the people, I'd push back and say, hey, should the people that don't show up have a voice? If they don't show up to care enough, why should we even listen to them?
I mean, the way we run the community engagement process really does privilege people who have flexible schedules and time to be able to show up at that, right? So if you think about if you have the meeting at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday, people who have a 9 to 5 job and who don't have evening responsibilities can show up. But what about the people who are, working at Walmart in the evening shift, who are working at the coffee shop? They're working during that time; they can't be there. Or
That's
families who have young kids are less likely to come out because they've got childcare in the evening. So we've structured this process around a very particular kind of engagement that's not necessarily typical of a lot of people. The other thing that's a little harder to persuade elected officials, it's not just about people who live in your community and vote there now. It's the people who don't live in your community but would like to. And that includes a lot of our essential workers. So many school teachers, firefighters, police officers, nurses can't afford to live in the communities where they work. And they rarely go to a community meeting in a city where they work, but they don't actually live there now, right? They're not current voters there. And those are very often the people who benefit from having more flexibility and from having more affordable housing.
Yeah, there's a lot of neighborhoods that I would love to live in, or a lot of communities I'd love to live in. It's like, oh man, it's just not going to happen. But I could see the essential worker piece being really important, and giving them, it's not necessarily that you're giving people that don't vote or shouldn't vote for that community a voice, so much so as you're just making the politicians aware that, hey, there are other voices and there are other ways to think about this rather than just the subgroups that are showing up to these meetings. How else do you think of zoning as being a problem? What other things within zoning, other than getting it changed? Why do we even have zoning altogether? Why is the argument not to get rid of zoning?
Getting rid of zoning doesn't necessarily solve the problem. And the easiest sort of counterexample is the UK doesn't have zoning, and it's the one country that has a worse housing market than the US, because it means that every single change of use on every parcel has to go through a discretionary review process. And that turns out actually to be worse than sort of assigning single family zoning as kind of our default level. I mean, I think there are a couple of pieces that we want to think about. Zoning was designed partly to separate out incompatible land uses. So nobody wants to have like the waste dump or the wastewater treatment facility across the house the street from their house or from a kindergarten or something like that. So kind of industrial uses that are noisy and smelly and difficult to be around, should be away from residential areas. And, very few people really argue against that. But we've really gone down a sort of a farther level of extreme of codifying the single family detached home as the only thing that can be built on more than 3/4 of the land even in urban areas. And that takes up the most amount of space. It's the most expensive to buy or to rent. And so that really locks out a lot of other potential and locks in these sort of, neighborhoods that are built out and can't add any more housing because of this kind of zoning constraint. We're learning, though, that there are other things beyond this sort of just like limiting the structures, things like building codes that require you to have 2 forms of egress for every apartment building forces them to have a lot of non-revenue generating space and to take up a bigger footprint for the building relative to the number of apartments that are in there. So that's also just an inefficient design and a relatively recent change in our building codes, right? If you go to New York, there are apartment buildings that have one staircase in the middle all over the city, and people are, hundreds of thousands of people are living in these, but they're illegal to rebuild the way. So we've basically passed a bunch of rules that make our current housing stock often illegal to rebuild as it is, which doesn't make a ton of sense intuitively. And so going back to things that, allow the kinds of housing structures that we've used to build, making those easier to build as of right, less of a kind of discretionary process on a case-by-case basis for every project, more kind of a clear system of rules of what you can build, which would really help to shorten the timeline. It is the process of building housing has gotten a lot longer over time. And speaking to people who lend money on construction projects, if it takes you 10 years, 12 years to get permission to build something and to complete construction, that is a long time to be carrying the costs without having completed housing that you can sell or rent to start recouping the money. And the length and complexity and uncertainty of the process is actually what kills an awful lot of deals.
Growing up, that is something that my father just kind of installed in me. Sean, you notice right here this project that they're planning and they're converting it from Milan in. I bet you the developer that starts that won't be the developer that actually builds those homes. And it takes them 12, 15 years to actually get them built. And it's the 4th developer that finally actually gets it completed at then twice the twice the price that it originally was. And those agreements that the city was trying to finagle in the beginning, those are all gone, through bankruptcies, and that no longer had the same weight that they were trying to get in the beginning. Things definitely change with time. And I think that's one of the bigger costs in there is, the carrying costs and the unexpected costs and the fees and the impact fees and everybody else trying to get their hand in the pot. When you think about zoning, it sounds like you're a lot more precise with what needs to be changed than the way I was thinking about it of, hey, 1 to 4 isn't a thing, it's just residential, and it could be anything 1 to 4, but then you kind of have like maybe big labels for zoning versus smaller subsets of zoning. Is that kind of the way to think about it? Or is it, yeah, single family does have its benefits in certain applications. We should still keep that, but we need to change it.
Yeah, I mean, we really think about the sort of high priority as adding more flexibility in the kinds of structures that can be built as of right. And there's 2 pieces of that. What is sort of the range of structures? So, duplexes, townhouses, 4plexes, 6plexes, like just expand the number of structures that you can build. But really crucial is this by right. So ministerial approval, meaning that the developer can walk in and say, I bought this piece of property. I want to build a 12-unit apartment building. Here are my plans. They meet all the architectural requirements for safety and soundness. And the clerk should be able to look at these plans and then just like you pay your fee and you get the permit and you go out and build. We used to do that. Now that's virtually impossible to do. And so making it easier through the process and more straightforward. If you obey the rules, you get to build this, and this should be a very straightforward process that you can just go out and get it done faster.
Yeah, permits by right, or you said it's structured in a different way, but it's almost like, hey, you've got your permit already with the right of the property. Go grab it off, like an off the shelf permit that you can just pull. However, if you want to go beyond that, I mean, that's just the common sense approach, right?
It's what we used to do.
Why is that not the thing? That I can walk in, aside from paying exorbitant fees in certain areas for just your right to build on your own land, which is kind of boggling to some people, right? You have to pay how much? Permits should be under $100, right? If you do it your way, what you're talking about right there, off the shelf, here's your right. That to me, that is a no-brainer. You don't have to have a bunch of employees saying yes or no. You don't have to have a bunch of meetings. The bureaucracy of the whole thing comes off the table. What's preventing communities from doing that, or jurisdictions, I should say, from adopting that?
Some of it is that people just really like control over what happens in their neighborhood. So the community process is really a chance for neighbors who live close by to be able to weigh in on things that get built. And, this is particularly sort of understandable in the case of big projects. So if you're going to have, a whole neighborhood redevelopment, you can understand that people care about what gets built there and what it looks like. But we have given essentially veto power to people who are already there, and often even in relatively small projects. And so, one of the big pushes is when you do like a citywide rezoning, it's still going to have to go through a public process. People are going to come out at hearings, but can we redo the comprehensive plan and the zoning plan and get all the community engagement up front? And then what's compatible with that new zoning can just go through in this very straightforward process. And you allow the city staff just to look at the plans, make sure they're safe, and then go forward. And so I think there's more of an understanding now that we need to shift when community engagement happens from the project by project decisions up to this level of, once every 10 years you redo the zoning, but after that, the community doesn't get to weigh in.
I'm chomping at the bit to ask this now. Please tell me that you've had success getting that applied somewhere. Like that there's some sort of model somewhere that somebody's adopted, and this is not just a pipe dream, but this can actually turn into reality.
So the really exciting thing is the last 5 to 7 years, there's been a lot of reform, both at the state level and at the local level, more communities trying to get to this sort of by right process with more flexibility. We've seen, this used to be entirely a local government issue. And then the last 7 or so years, state governments have realized the state isn't building enough homes to accommodate job growth. And so the state is really hurting economically. California got itself in the deepest hole fastest, but has also been trying very hard to dig itself out, right? And Buffy Wicks has done a great job in Sacramento, really pushing on this and continuing to hammer on it. Oregon, Washington State have also done a lot, but we've also seen some of the red states, Montana, Texas, Florida, have all passed pretty aggressive packages of laws to make it easier to build more different kinds of homes in more communities. Texas and Florida have also gotten those laws sort of into effect really quickly. Florida's Live Local Act was passed a couple of years. They've got more than 70,000 projects that are in the pipeline, or units that are in the pipeline, primarily apartments in kind of commercial corridors. So think about like a single-story strip mall. You can redevelop that into an apartment building. So that has taken off, particularly in South Florida. Texas passed similar residential and commercial and some other reforms, small lot subdivisions. And they've already got, I think, 8,000 units that are in the construction pipeline, and they passed this in 2025. So we've been really excited to see that some of the states that are getting into the game, particularly the red states that are more business friendly, have managed to get this stuff off the ground pretty quickly.
I imagine that your office has a map of the United States on it, and it gets shaded in green when some of these pass. Is that kind of like the main goal? You
I
throw
got
a party when you get one?
spreadsheets, but yeah.
Okay. No. I'm just imagining, but that seems like it would be the holy grail of an achievement for what you're trying to accomplish, right? State level change that pushes that hard.
It's a really important first step. State level change sometimes pushes the new requirements to localities. So it doesn't always go into effect right away. Often it means that local governments have to go back and rewrite their zoning to come into compliance. So there can be a couple of years of this sort of transition period. One of the things we're really interested in understanding is how do you shorten that period? How do you get from the state law into local rules that actually make sense, and developers who are able to go out and break ground and get houses up and running as quickly as possible?
That is amazing, because it really changes the game when you know what you're buying. If I'm looking, my wife and I are looking to build a property, I know ahead of time, you're de-risking me and saying, there's not going to be any surprises when I show up. And I think it's even much worse than the way you do it. Today I may get Bob, and tomorrow I may get Charlie, and Charlie wants it done this way and Bob wants, and they're working the same department. And it's a matter of almost like an opinion level thing that it gets, that you get bogged down with, or interpretation. Right. And what you're saying is it doesn't matter who you get. You can just read about it online, and this is what you're going to be entitled to, when you purchase that property, and it may have a single family today, but you could probably do 4 units, and the predictability is there. The carrying costs, become much lower. The cities, in California, they don't have to worry about the unfunded pension liability and hiring more people. And, it just gets a lot more simpler when you can be transparent and upfront with people.
Yeah, and this is another part of the hearts and minds thing. It's not just about kind of voters and elected officials, although they're really important, but we also need to be talking to building inspectors, people who work in planning departments, helping them figure out what works better and streamlining the process and giving them the confidence that they're not going to get in trouble with their boss if they allow projects to move forward faster. Because sometimes the career staff who work in the buildings department are worried, if I let a building go through and get approved and it winds up not being safe, or the neighbors are mad and yell, then the city council member is going to come and yell at me, and I'm the one who's going to take the blame.
That's the cultural problem, right? That's I got to protect my butt if, I know what to do is right, but doing it the right way and doing it the ethical way isn't always, what gets you promoted or what doesn't get you fired. Right. And I know for a fact that exists. And, as sad as it is, it sounds like this solves it. Any other big things on I want to say your goal board up on the wall, that you want us to be aware of? I think the zoning conversation is just immensely fascinating and important, but are any ones out there that you think we may be missing today?
I mean, once we figure out how to crack the zoning code and get better zoning in place everywhere, which is still a ways off, I think we do still have some questions about building code, sort of the hard costs of construction. Some of the hard costs are things like interest rates or the cost of steel and concrete, which we don't control locally or even nationally. But there are things that we could do. Parking reform has actually been one of the big kind of undersold stories. A structured parking spot can cost $50,000 to build, and that's just the parking spot. That's not the house or the apartment. So if you require 2 off-street parking spaces for a 2-bedroom apartment, that's $100,000 to build the parking. If we build more apartments near transit stations, not everybody who lives there is going to have a car or is going to have 2 cars per household. So you can lower that requirement, let the developer be more flexible about how much parking they think that particular location needs, and that can save you money just right off the bat. So looking for fixes like that, where the rules are requiring things that don't add health and safety and that just add costs, that's kind of the next frontier.
Yeah, that one just kind of got my mind going. I've never even thought about that. Never even thought about that one, and I'm sure there's a lot like it that makes sense. If you can change, snap your fingers and change one thing about policy or reform, what is the one thing that you would change that would make a lot of this go away?
I would legalize townhouses everywhere in the country as of right on relatively small lots. We spend a lot of, townhouses are kind of this little secret weapon here.
Yeah, I have no idea where you're going with this one. So out of everything, you're going townhouses. So
I'm going
tell me why townhouses solves this huge problem. I'm fascinated.
It's a really efficient, land efficient kind of structure. So there's a lot of attention to things like accessory dwelling units, the backyard cottages, but that relies on individual homeowners to build them. And that's a very particular kind of housing. Townhouses are a thing we know how to build. Our existing builders can roll these things out and build them very quickly. We've got lots of different floor plans that are already done. It works for rental housing. It works for entry-level homeownership housing. It's just a very efficient use of land because you don't need that much to get a lot of homes, but it's still small scale, feels very neighborhood scale and human scale. Imagine, I used to live in Boston. The Boston suburbs have these 2-acre minimum lot sizes. Imagine if you could buy one house sitting on 2 acres of land and you could put a 20 unit townhouse cluster that has little yards for all of them just on one parcel. So we could actually
And
tackle
2 acres. That's a lot for 2 acres.
2 acre minimum lot size. Like you can get a lot of
Oh,
townhouses on
minimum.
that
Okay. I was
minimum
like, wow,
lot size.
I was like, oh, I'm doing the math, and I was like, oh, wow, and a yard. Well, no, okay, so town, I can see that. So we're kind of like talking about we're venturing into the missing middle conversation, right? It's
Absolutely.
2, 3, the duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, or fourplexes, whatever you want to call it. So letting people build you want to build it, great. Single family, doesn't matter. You put it on the lot.
Yeah. And one of the reasons why I like townhouses more than duplexes or fourplexes is just that we already build a lot of them. And so we know how to do this. The duplexes and fourplexes, we used to build a lot in the 1920s through 40s, but it's just not something that we do a ton of today. And so we have fewer builders who are used to doing that.
Explain this to me, because this is one of those that for me personally, when I think of like a fourplex, and then I think of a townhome, I think a townhome, attached wall, right? That's kind of like the you have an attached wall, but you could also have a townhome that has more than 2 units, right? They're stacked on. Is it still a townhome if you have 4 units? Say, you go vertical, you have 2 units on the top, 2 units on the bottom, all sharing a common wall. So they're all sharing one common wall. Is that still called a townhouse, or does that get a special name that I don't know about?
So there's a stacked townhouse, which is probably,
townhouse.
yeah. But I mean, the exterior structure that looks like a townhouse, you can configure in a lot of ways. In DC, where I live, a lot of the older townhouses have been subdivided into condos. And so if you've got, a 3-story townhouse plus basement, it may be a 1-family house on the inside, or it could be 8 condos. And from the outside, you can't tell the difference.
Oh, super interesting. Yeah, see, you learn a little something each time. All right, at the end of the podcast here, and we're approaching the end. I know we're running up on time. We do a little rapid fire session. So I'm just going to ask you a couple questions, and we'd just love to hear your feedback, right? Recent book that you have read that you think everybody should read.
So sticking within there's a book called Stuck by Yoni Applebaum. It talks about kind of the history of neighborhoods, and it's a fascinating book. It gets really deep into the history of the US and people's kind of mobility over time.
Love it. I love those little gems that teach you a little bit about history and finance, or I think there's one out there for banking right now that's really hot, and anything housing and why we do things in America is super fascinating. Recent product that you've discovered that you just can't live without, and I'll give you mine, and I got one on my desk today, but I got my Ember mug that just keeps my coffee at the exact same temperature, first sip to last sip. Not endorsed by them, but I absolutely love my Ember mug. So what is it for you?
So we recently changed over our gas stove to an induction stove, which means, of course, that you have to go buy new cookware. And so I live and die by my Le Creuset Dutch oven. Works perfectly. The induction cooktop is made for like the flat bottom, cooks beautifully. I can boil water for pasta in like 90 seconds. It's amazing.
I don't think people realize how and they're different, gas to very, very different cooking styles. But I think when it comes to boiling water, people don't realize how fast that water actually boils.
If you make pasta a lot, it is life-changing.
You can't saute, like a chef, but there's some cool points. So no, that's really, really interesting. Now, how should everybody get in touch with you? If they found something like super interesting, they want to reach out, learn a little bit more, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
They can ping me on LinkedIn. My first and last name, Jenny Schuetz, Schuetz, and I'm on LinkedIn pretty often, and I read my messages.
Oh, fantastic. And we'll go ahead and maybe a link to your bio and help them get to you as well. But absolutely awesome having you on the podcast. Hope to have you on here again in the future. But this was absolutely fantastic, and hope to have you on soon.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
This podcast is intended for educational and informational purposes only and does not replace independent professional judgment. Land Gorilla Inc. makes no representations, warranties, or promises for and disclaims any express or implied warranties related to content. Before acting on any information, you should consider the appropriateness of the information as it pertains to your unique business needs.